Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast introduction to today's program. My interview with Dr. Richard Slotkin, emeritus professor of history at Wesleyan in Middletown, Connecticut, the author of a really important new book, A Great Disorder, National Myth and the Battle for America. He previously wrote a series of books on the frontier, beginning in 1973 with Regeneration Through Violence, the mythology of the American frontier, 1600 to 1860. What an extraordinary man. And I just have to say, I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I've had access to some of the great minds of our time, and there will be more. We're just getting started here. We need your help. Truly, we need your help. And if you're willing to help, that's what we're going to do with it. And I want to talk with all the best thinkers in the country, historians, novelists, essayists, policy people. There's a centrist politics to what we're doing, and I think some of you would think centrist with a left-leaning centrist, but it's not far left at all. I'm a very conservative person in some important respects, and I'm as a humanities scholar, I am not interested in an echo chamber of the so-called enlightened ones. But these people are world-class historians like Richard Rhodes, who wrote The Making of the Atomic Bomb, and I'm going to be interviewing him again early next week. And here's Richard Slotkin. And, we have David Nicandri, who's now written his most recent book on what happened after Captain Cook with respect to the search for the Northwest Passage. And so this is a golden time. I couldn't have imagined this even 5 years ago, but now these technologies allow us to cross space at low expense to talk to extraordinary people who then bring their insights and their wisdom to us. And I find that just unbelievably satisfying. So help us. We need to have some research assistants. We need a producer for this program. We need someone who will make cold calls. I'm terrible at that, but to contact people and say, would you be willing to come on? And frankly, not everyone at this point would be willing to come on the Thomas Jefferson Hour because it's Jefferson, and Jefferson is in the minds of many sort of toxic. But the new moniker, Listening to America, is, in my opinion, absolutely perfect because it allows a very wide range, and it also is bigger than the Founding Fathers. In some respects, the founding generation is a trap, and although it's glorious to think about it, write about it, and debate and reevaluate, it locks us into a kind of a mythic past. And Listening to America is meant to be open to the world today, but with a strong historical base and, frankly, a Jeffersonian politics. And by Jeffersonian politics, I mean this: civility, the free marketplace of ideas, good, bad, and otherwise, respect for the other, a commitment to certain ideals like equality, access, dignity, the capacity to earn a living with a living wage, the belief that everybody has to be at the table, that new voices are absolutely essential, that there is room for reform in all institutions, whether from Congress, or the church, but also to the way our academies, our universities are operating. So that Enlightenment package of tolerant but rigorous, evidence-based discourse, emphasizing civility with an open mind and curiosity, that's the purpose. That's what I'm trying to do. And I'm the luckiest man in the world because I love to be the interlocutor, but I'm more satisfied when I'm asking questions of extraordinary people and then listening carefully and teasing out follow-up questions and bringing some humor to it and bringing some irony to it and adding bits of my own historical understanding and then having them take it farther or tell me that I'm full of beans, whichever it is. That's my chief joy, and I want to do much more of it. I'd like a bigger megaphone. I'd like to share these great thinkers with more people in the country. And so if you can help, that's what we want to do with it. This is a labor of love. I take nothing from it except psychic satisfaction, but the psychic satisfaction is gigantic. And today, my library downstairs, as you know, huge, 20,000 volumes, which are straining the woodwork. That library has 3 or 4 books by Richard Slotkin, and I've been reading him all my life. To tell you the truth, I would not have interviewed him about his book, Regeneration Through Violence, although it's fascinating. But this book, Great Disorder, the minute I saw it, it automatically I push purchase, because this is exactly what I'm trying to address. My question is this: who are we in 2026? What's our national narrative? What parts of the American idea do we still agree about? How much, if life is Venn diagrams, how much overlap is there between the view of the left and the view of the right, the view of the liberals and the view of the conservatives, the view of the Whole Foods people and the view of the Cracker Barrel people, the view of the urban Americans and the view of the heartland Americans? What's the overlap? And I believe there is a strong but damaged overall consensus about America. Just this morning, to be sitting here at my desk with a relatively inexpensive recording device, listening to one of the great scholars of our time talk in a relaxed and fluid way about a massive book that he wrote, and his sense of humor is really delightful. And he wasn't one of those people where the interviewer just tees it up and gets out of the way. He wanted a conversation, and we had one, and that was very, very refreshing for me. So let's go to the program, but you take my point, and if you can help us, please do. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. I have the great honor today of talking with Professor Richard Slotkin, Emeritus Professor of History at Wesleyan University and the author of a number of really important books, beginning with Regeneration Through Violence, 1973, but others, including now, most recently, A Great Disorder, National Myth and the Battle for America. Welcome, Professor Slotkin.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
All right, so here's my question. We're moving towards the 250th birthday of the United States. You and I are both old enough to have been around for the bicentennial. Now it's 250 on July 4th, 2026, and these occasions invite us to step back and evaluate where we are, how we got here, what we stand for, a national origin story, how well things are working. It gives each of us an opportunity to assess America and America at a quarter of a millennium. And I'll tell you candidly that I'm worried about the 250th birthday. It feels to me like it's going to be a cultural bloodbath, that the fissure that's at the center of American life now is going to play itself out in some pretty uncivil ways when we approach 2026. And I'm hoping you can provide some clarity about what weight should we give to the crisis that we're now in. So pick it up from there.
Well, I think it's a severe crisis for a few reasons. I think it's been characterized as a culture war. I think that's fair. I think if you look at the way that the partisan groups have divided themselves, that the issues that come to the fore are cultural rather than economic. That's not to say that people aren't worried about inflation, but when you ask people to think about a program of things that they want to do to change the economic situation, I don't get the sense that anyone has a very clear idea. Some people do, but there's no like mass movement to say, oh, let's all unionize or something like that, or let's all cut off all trade with the world. I don't think there's anything that clear. I think the issues that get people riled up and ready to participate in politics are cultural issues. Questions of belief and the practice of belief that are really critical.
This is not the first time we've had a moment of disintegration. The most famous, of course, is the Civil War, when things broke down entirely and almost 800,000 Americans wound up being killed. Is this the biggest crisis for America in your lifetime? You were born in 1942.
Well, it's kind of hard to compare anything with World War II. So putting that to one side, yeah, it's a crisis that seems to me more severe than the one I lived through in the 60s and 70s. If I compare Richard Nixon and Donald Trump as presidential threats, in a funny way, Nixon on paper was worse. He was a person who understood how government worked. He knew where the levers of power were. He was willing to use the IRS and the FBI against political opponents. Whereas Trump doesn't have that level of competence. But Nixon was still committed to certain fundamentals about the way that the country worked. And let me just use the word consent. That he understood that leadership in a republic depends on the consent of the governed, and that he had lost the consent of the governed, as expressed through his party primarily, but in general through the people's representatives. And lacking that consent, he couldn't continue. I don't think Trump cares about consent. He'll manufacture consent. If he loses consent, he'll claim he had it anyway, as he's done already. And it makes me more frightened than I was under Nixon. Nixon, I had this weird attitude of, okay, you've got the White House horrors or something. Bring it on. Let's have it out. I don't feel that way now.
No, and just to remind everybody, when the Supreme Court said that Nixon must turn over the tapes, he did. He complained about it. He whined about it. He said it was an imposition. He invoked executive privilege, but in the end, he turned over the tapes. When Barry Goldwater and others of the establishment came over to the White House in that famous moment and said, "You're done here. You've got to go," Nixon left. He was an institutionalist, a corrupt one, but he was an institutionalist.
Yeah, and I think let me put another, to connect what I just said to what we're talking about with the culture wars, that what's behind Trump is a movement which is not entirely Trumpian. Trump is kind of sui generis as a figure, but there's a movement that he's become the vehicle for, which is a very seriously divisive movement that does represent an attempt to turn back the clock, culturally speaking. And I think it's a serious movement. I think it's got a popular base. I think it lends itself to clear programs in certain areas and just a general attitude towards governance, which is full of possibilities for civil violence.
At the end of your book, you ask the question, what happens to Trumpism after Trump? Sometime in the next 20 years, he will be gone. He may not win the election of 2024. If he wins the election, he may not serve out a second term for one reason or another. And so we can't let this conversation be about Donald Trump. You say he's sui generis, by which you mean he's sort of a unique figure. But behind him is this movement of grievance, of desire to live sort of in a pre-1960s Ozzie and Harriet America, with echoes in it of white supremacy and white nationalism and the kind of some of the lingering apartheidism in the American South and so on. So this phenomenon is much bigger than Trump. Trump's political genius, if you want to call it that, was to recognize it and tap it.
Yeah, to articulate it, and to just by articulating grievance, that's the other thing, the mood of grievance and anger. He does it originally was a kind of a blank screen onto which you could project any kind of anger that you had, or almost any, I shouldn't say any anger, almost any kind of anger that you had, if it was connected with ethnicity, with immigration, with race, with government regulation. Then he was your voice.
Let me make the case for anxiety, but not rage. Since around 1960, American life has changed dramatically. The women's movement, the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, we have really evolved or developed in some startling ways. And even a few years ago, people like Barack Obama and Joe Biden said, "I'm not comfortable with same-sex marriage," and so on. These changes are so fast, breathtaking. Now couple them with the emerging technologies of our time and the threat of AI and so on, social media. I think that millions of Americans have a legitimate reason to feel anxious, right? And that anxiety doesn't necessarily need to be rage.
You're talking about transformations that we identify as things that began in the 1960s. And at the same time that those transformations were going on, you had the New Deal concept of politics and of economic justice coming to a kind of culmination in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and blowing up with the urban riots and so on. You had a certain notion of American engagement in foreign affairs as the liberating power, identified with JFK in the early 60s, suddenly comes up against the Vietnam War and collapses. So there is a kind of a breakdown of the sort of liberal tradition in American politics that occurs at the end of the 60s, at the same time that the culture is becoming liberalized and liberated, as you point out, race, gender, sexuality. But while politics is moving right, the culture as you said, it just keeps moving left, so that you get a kind of mismatch between the two. And I really locate the 1990s as the turning point. Pat Buchanan's speech in 1992, which inaugurates the idea of culture war, where he says Reagan didn't do anything for conservative culture. He did great stuff for the corporate economy, but he didn't do anything on abortion. He didn't do anything on homosexuality, blah, blah. He didn't do anything against affirmative action. And now it's time to act on the cultural agenda. And I think that our own culture war really begins at that point.
So some people put this at 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan. Others want to target Newt Gingrich for his overt desire to weaponize politics of the right against the liberal world order. And he was enormously successful in this. And we're continuing to live with the legacy of all of that. It's all troubling. I'm talking to Richard Slotkin. Rich, let me ask you another question before we go to our first break. Why did you write this book? Why did you write A Great Disorder, National Myth, and the Battle for America?
Well, because I felt that culture war was really what was going on. I'm a cultural historian, and the theory of national myth that I've been working with for 60 years, really, I think offers some ways of decoding the way in which history is being used as battle flags and as ways of structuring a response to the crisis that we're in right now.
I guess there are several 100 million people who are bewildered by where we are. I can tell you in my own case, Rich, I never expected in the course of my lifetime to be worried about the very survival of the Republic, the very survival of our constitutional norms. I didn't feel that in 1968. I didn't feel that in Iran-Contra. I haven't ever felt that until now. And now I actually, and I'm sure you wrestle with this all the time, some days I think, oh, no, we muddle through, we'll get through this. The balance will be restored in some way. This is just a kind of an American intifada, and it will fade, and then we will not maybe be the same, but we will return to constitutional norms. And then on other days, I think this thing could collapse, and there are signs that it will. How do you wrestle with your own historical knowledge and insights, and also your own concerns as a citizen and a human being in the year 2024?
Well, as a scholar, what I have to do is to look at the situation coldly and say these are the potentials in the situation, and I think the potentials of the situation are truly disastrous for several reasons, which I can go into. But the other thing is, in writing the book, is I wanted to see if it was possible, given my understanding of the way in which we organize our thinking about the American past, to imagine a way of rethinking that past that would actually be operative in the discourse of politics, not simply some abstraction, set of abstractions, but a story that had the appeal of, just to take one example, the lost cause, all those Confederate flags being waved on January 6th. What's the left answer to the Confederate battle flag?
We need to take a short break. I'm talking with the eminent Richard Slotkin, author of a number of books, including a novel about Abraham Lincoln's childhood, which won an important award. We'll be back in this special edition of Listening to America in just a moment. Stay tuned. Back to Listening to America. I'm talking to Richard Slotkin about where we are as a nation as we approach the 250th birthday of our republic, born on the 4th of July, 1776, and now edging in on the 4th of July, 2026, and the country seems to be diseased, disintegrating, disturbed. All sorts of bad energies seem to be floating about. It doesn't feel to me that there's a great deal to celebrate at the moment, and yet, of course, there is. We're the richest country in the world, our fabulous innovation in the United States, for the haves at least, and most Americans are essentially the haves it's never been so good. We have access to more tools, more mobility, more gadgets, more entertainments, more access, and I think truly more equality than ever before in the history of the country. So there's a lot of good news here, but the country's in a bad mood, which I find so startling. You know, Harold Macmillan told the British people in the early 1960s, we've never had it so good. You've never had it so good. That's how I feel about America in many respects. That doesn't mean there aren't unresolved issues to continue to approach, but why do you think we're so grumpy? Why do you think we're disturbed in this way?
I think it's, again, a mismatch between politics and the values and expectations generated by a culture that is very varied. If you think about the 21st century, it starts out with the shock of 9/11, which violates all kinds of expectations and understandings about what our power is, what our vulnerabilities are, and what they aren't. You go to a war in Iraq that was under false pretenses, unnecessary, bloody, prolonged, and ultimately useless. You follow that up with the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, when the deregulation sponsored by both Democrats and Republicans since the 1980s, 90s produces an economic catastrophe. And what happens? The government bails out the bankers, and I won't say doesn't relieve the distress of Main Street, but stints on the relief of the distress of Main Street. And barely are we beginning to come out of that, then COVID hits and plunges us back into economic and social disarray. So there are things that have happened that have caused us to question whether our government knows what the hell it's doing, and to think that maybe it doesn't. And I don't know what takes its place, but certainly rage and the sense of grievance, the disaffection with government begotten by those real world events plays into the cultural discontent that comes from the unresolved cultural developments, changes from the 60s. That in fact, the cultural liberalization of the 60s left a lot of people out and left a lot of people behind and scared a lot of people that they were losing their cultural position, their cultural authority, and the values that they wanted to protect, preserve, and pass to their children. So it's a multi-level crisis in that sense. But I really see it as this mismatch between culture and politics.
So I can understand the anxiety and the fear and the rage and the reaction. I don't myself subscribe to it, but there are places where I feel anxious myself about some of the rapidity of change in the nation, particularly on the AI and the electronification of culture and so on. But if I feel that way, Rich, you can't turn back the clock. We're not going to outlaw same-sex marriage. It's too late for that. We're probably not going to return prayer to schools. It's too late for that. We're not going to rebuild the family, no matter how much we wring our hands about the disintegration of the family. In other words, as you said, there's been a kind of a progressive leftist movement dynamic in the culture, and it continues. It doesn't seem to be slowing down, and politics is sort of running behind it, trying to figure out what to make of it. But that's not going to stop, is it?
I think it could. I mean, if you look at what I call in the book the culture war between the states, that we're developing a split in the way state governments are run, in which states adopt different laws on very fundamental questions: voting rights, gender and sexuality, how those are defined, how history is taught in the public schools, what you may and may not teach in the public schools, abortion, health care. And you really are in danger of institutionalizing in political structures the terms of the culture war. So you say, you can't go back on same-sex marriage. Well, I think Louisiana has given it a shot, and Alabama is going to give it a shot. States are thinking about banning contraception. So I think that things are reversible at the state level. And here's again where the interplay of culture and politics happens. If politics leaves culture alone, its tendency has been to liberalize. But if you get control of enough political structures, you can use the power of the state to impose cultural change. Now, it may not be positive cultural change. It may just be destructive. You can impose the end of abortion rights. You can't necessarily impose what follows abortion rights, but you sure as hell can change the material conditions under which cultural life proceeds by exercising your power in that way. And the way states, I mean, the way people think about their lives and their bodies and pregnancy and family life in Texas, if the current legal structure hangs on there, is going to be very different from those same things in New York or Maryland, where I am now, California.
Certainly, and you see that the legislation is either already passed in some places or going through the process. But just to take the reverse of Roe v. Wade of a couple of years ago by the Supreme Court of the United States in the Dobbs decision, the promise was that if we return this under the 10th Amendment to the states, that this would be sorted out regionally and locally. But the people in those states have been almost unanimous since then in saying, no, we're not banning abortion. We might put up with some restriction on abortion access, but we're not going to permit that to happen. And it seems to me that if Jefferson were in this conversation, he would make a kind of a Gulliver argument that the people are like Gulliver, they're sort of being tied to the ground. But if they snapped the cords of this, if the people got upset enough, they would take back the country because the numbers of the people who are essentially progressives, in some sense of that term, is dramatically larger than the people who are trying to turn back the clock. Isn't that so?
I believe that to be so. But the distribution of that majority is not strategic, so that the way the political structure works, the structures of authority in this country work, a minority can impose its will on the way that the culture conducts itself. And we do see that with the abortion issue. Why is it that the pro-choice majority in Alabama never gets to control the state legislature? Is it racial voting? I don't think so. It's that the people who belong to that majority, it's not important enough. And the question is, which cultural issue that is being shifted to the right on this is so important that you will, in fact, get out and vote. Gun rights is another one of these things where there's an overwhelming majority in favor of things like universal background checks and red flag laws. But people don't vote that. They vote something else. They vote Donald Trump is a strong businessman. They vote I don't like paying high taxes. Democrats will tax me. That majority doesn't express itself politically.
I think part of it is a certain complacency. I think most Americans thought that we had reached a kind of a settlement, that abortion would always be legal with some restrictions, that we would move towards more and more people being eligible to vote with maybe a setback here or there, that we would move towards greater conservation of our natural resources and our public lands with some interruptions of it from time to time. I think most people who would identify themselves as centrists or progressives would say, we thought the country had kind of reached a steady state. And I think everyone is shocked that this movement is actually turning the clock back in some important ways in some places.
Yes, I think that's right. I just think that's exactly the situation. I think there was a certain amount of cultural complacency, particularly on abortion. There have been a number of articles written on this lately that people knew something bad was going to happen to Roe v. Wade. They didn't use that knowledge to change zombie laws that were on the statute books. I mean, yeah, I think that's true. On the other hand, to turn it around, the Supreme Court's attack on the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby case, that was out of the blue. There was no way to anticipate that would be done. And what you saw there is that once the political power gave permission to get out from under the scrutiny of the Civil Rights Act, Shelby County went back to good old white supremacy Shelby County with voter restrictions. And nothing will happen to reverse the Shelby decision.
I was amazed that decision by the court didn't get a gigantic national backlash. We sort of said, we're not that comfortable with the decision, but okay. And I think it was a fatal mistake by the American people to let this happen.
Yeah, the another one that's like that to me is the Bruin decision, which opens up gun rights issue that you can only pass a gun rights act that would have been acceptable in 1790, which is absurd, which is A, absurd, and B, unknowable. And no one can figure out what the founding fathers would have done about AR-15s. The more critical one there is that it's about the right to carry your gun anywhere. That's the critical thing. I mean, you can own any kind of gun you want as long as the law says, yeah, but you can't, walk down Broadway with the thing or walk into a schoolyard with the thing. People objected to it. There's an outcry against it, but there's no movement against it. There were local movements, but nothing that really turns an election on that issue.
Yes, and so I want to start the conversation about narrative. So I studied classics when I was a university student, and we read the Aeneid. And after almost 200 years of civil war and turmoil in Rome, Virgil is encouraged by the Emperor Augustus to write an epic which will recreate a national narrative that somehow fits the evidence on the ground, and he does. And the Aeneid turns out to be the myth of Rome in the post-Republican period. It worked. It seems to me that we now lack an American narrative, that you have 340 million Americans. It used to be something like this. The Pilgrims came, other people came to different parts of the country. Unfortunately, there's slavery, but don't hold that against us. The westward movement, which is one of your greatest areas of interest. Yes, there was the Civil War, but afterwards we bound the country back together. In the 20th century, we were sort of forced into becoming the most important nation in the world, which we did with great reluctance, but that we use our power on the whole benevolently, etc. You know that myth. That's the story, right? But that story is no longer agreed upon by something like a consensus.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think what you have is a set of competing narratives that are the banners of the culture war. Take today, the ceremonies around D-Day is a perfect exercise of what I call in my book the good war myth. Right. The idea that in World War II, America came together like a platoon, the multiracial, multi-ethnic platoon, united to fight a common enemy and free the world from the threat of totalitarianism. And that has been in the past a unifying myth. But one of the things that happens to stories is that every time you deploy a myth, you test it. And the good war myth was tested in Korea, tested in Vietnam, tested in Iraq and Afghanistan, and people have become skeptical of it. So that you get, although it's still a very potent myth, particularly with liberals, there's a lot of suspicion of it on the America First side, on the right. A lot of skepticism, for example, about applying the good war analogy to Ukraine, where it would seem to be most obvious, and as Biden actually did in his speech today.
A few years ago, I was 15 maybe, aspirant for the Senate from Nevada said we may need to use Second Amendment solutions, and we didn't shrug, but we thought, there's an idiot. But now it's all come to pass. I mean, now there is a serious movement of millions, well, hundreds of thousands of people at the very least who believe this. We may have to take this country back at the end of an AR-15.
Yes. Yeah, I've actually been writing about that since 1991. So I wasn't surprised when Second Amendment rights were invoked, because the NRA had been talking about that really since the early 1990s. Grover Norquist, the anti-tax guy, says, if they take your guns, then you'll have no say about paying taxes, as if you had the right to use your guns to resist paying taxes. That's a critical element. And, we talk about anger as a mood, but put anger together with a rationale rooted in history to use violence, and you've got something which is profoundly threatening to civil order.
Plus, you've got a founding father, my favorite, Thomas Jefferson, who is sort of the philosopher of violence under certain circumstances. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. That is its natural manure. I like a little rebellion now and then. He defended the reign of terror. He's their guy, right? I mean, Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson are the founders who invoked the uses of violence in extremity to produce the right ends.
Yeah, well, they're revolutionaries, right? They fomented a revolution, a colonial uprising against the British Empire. So yeah, of course they believe in violence as an instrument of politics. But taking that example of a revolution against an empire and applying it to your dislike of the person who is supposed to be checking you in at the voting booth, or the ordinary collection of federal taxes, seeing that as the basis for armed resistance is anarchy. Lincoln is the counter to Jefferson on this. He says, when an issue has been fairly decided by ballots, there is no excuse for a resort to bullets in a free government. And if you want a free government, you renounce the use of bullets. And they're not renouncing the use of bullets.
I want to read a passage from your book, Rich, and I want your response to it. It's page 383. American democracy is caught in a potential death spiral in which our failure to find political solutions for these endemic problems produces an enraged and aggrieved hyperpartisanship, which in turn makes it impossible for government to make the kinds of regulatory change and public investment needed to address the problems. To break out of the spiral, we must develop a durable social consensus about what has gone wrong and what should be done about it, a consensus that sets parameters within which both parties can operate and compromise, and has the moral legitimacy conferred by a shared understanding of national myth. That's absolutely brilliant. That's my favorite paragraph in your book. I want to ask you about that in a minute, but fat chance, Rich. I mean, fat chance, right? A shared understanding of national myth, a new consensus, an agreement about what went wrong and what should be done about it. That's where we aren't.
It was my obligation, I think, to say what was necessary to solve the situation. But I think I also made it clear that I don't think that the constituents of such a resolution are ready to hand. It is possible that they can be fabricated, but they are not ready to hand. I could have ended the book there. The reason I didn't is that I cannot, in good conscience, end on a purely negative note. There has to be a possibility for future action, or what's the point of writing anything? And so, yeah, I go beyond that to suggest what such a new vision might and a new program might look like. But I do not see that as ready to hand.
How long did it take you to write this book?
Oh, to actually write, I've been thinking about something along these lines for quite a long time, actually, for maybe 20 years. To really write it really started in 2019, and 2019 to 2023 when it was finally finished.
Do you write on a keyboard?
Yeah, I do now. Yeah, sure. Of course. I used to write on a typewriter, and I used to cut and paste by actually cutting and pasting. So yes.
The revolution of Word.
Oh yeah.
It's astonishing. Imagine if you had to type a book today.
Yes. I can't imagine how I did it.
Right. Or how about the world without the internet? Because if you write that the GDP of Ukraine is such, back in 1970, you would have had to go to a resource library, and you could spend weeks tracking down stuff you can track down in 12 minutes today. We need to take a short break. Fascinating conversation with Professor Richard Slotkin. His new book, A Great Disorder, National Myth and the Battle for America. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Listening to America. I'm with Richard Slotkin in his home in Maryland, emeritus professor of history at Wesleyan, and one of my favorite authors. You've written about the frontier all of your life. I live on the frontier in North Dakota. That myth is a very potent one. Here, its version is essentially the Little House on the Prairie myth, that these people from all over the world, but largely Nordics, came out onto the Great Plains, and thanks to the Homestead Act and the transcontinental railroads, they got their homesteads and they assimilated into the culture, and they became the kind of the rural backbone of virtue in the United States. But here's what's happened. Since the 1960s, we now pay attention to Native Americans. Back then, the story was largely a triumphalist story. No responsible historian today can tell a triumphalist version of the frontier myth any longer. We know of the cost of empire to the land, to minorities, but particularly to Native Americans. The Cultural Revolution of the 60s forced us to look at things that we didn't previously give much weight. And now that we have to look at them, it's almost impossible to maintain the energy of those old mythic structures, but there's not exactly an alternative yet that has emerged that we can feel good about. And you have to be able to feel good about your national narrative, don't you?
Yeah, I think you do. You have to have some sort of sense that there's something positive to relate to. You can't grow up learning to hate your history and love your country, since your country is its history. I think about this as a historian, but also as a novelist. That is, how do you tell a story that overcomes the things that we now recognize were dark or evil about the way we conducted ourselves in growing the country. You can tell the story of the Indian Wars truly as long as you give the indigenous side an equal voice or a comparable voice. As long as you recognize that, William Henry Harrison, old Tippecanoe, was a patriot, but so was Tecumseh. There was a valid set of values, a valid culture that the indigenous warriors were defending against the settlers. The outcome is the outcome. The way it was conducted is the way it was conducted. You can deal with the way in which the settlers and the settlers' nation betrayed promises made in treaties. But think about it, can you imagine, was there some other way to arrange that treaty so that it was more equitable? There was an actual degree of fairness. Take treat history as a species of moral inquiry and ask what could have been done better. Not to say they were evil people because they didn't do it. They had the blinders on. That's why they didn't do it. But can we imagine some better way to do it? And is that a lesson that we can apply looking forward? And lastly, in every phase, Lincoln said it with the Declaration of Independence, that it is a moral charter to which we labor and struggle and maybe don't ever perfectly realize, but we're trying. That's a way to tell the story. There has been a struggle from the start to see if you could include everyone who is in the society, in the political society, make them all citizens, give them all the rights that are enjoyed by those who are full members of the society, define the society in that way. And we can tell the story in terms of that struggle in which there will be periods of desperate defeat. Jim Crow is a defeat following the Civil War, treated as such. It's not the history can be posited without being a straight line going up, can be a zigzag line with a tendency to go up, something like that, bending the arc, as Obama liked to say.
Right, the almost now overused cliche of the arc of justice, but there's truth to it, of course. But if you talk about inevitability in Native Americans just for a moment, we could have honored the Great Sioux Treaty of 1868. We didn't have to just force its dissolution through war. We could have honored permanent Indian territory in Oklahoma. We didn't. In other words, so many people, and I'm one of them, of course, in most moods you think, oh, isn't this sort of inevitable? A land-hungry, advanced European culture with incredible weaponry and technology meets a culture that is a steady state, in some ways, I won't say primitive, but a fundamental culture. Inevitably, this leads to the loss of lands and so on of native people. But is that really true? As you know from your work, choice after choice after choice after choice has been made in American history to violate important American principles in order to get the gold out of the Black Hills, in order to take lands from native peoples for other projects and so on.
Yeah, the difference there that you've stated between choice and the concept of inevitability. We tend to treat the traditional way of teaching history as a kind of destiny. America is going to rise from colony to world power. And there's basically nothing that can stop that. Even if you regret some things that happen, you can't stop it. But if you treat the history as a good novelist would treat a story, as a good storyteller would tell a story, as a series of choices with consequences, choices and consequences, it seems to me you humanize the story, you make it relatable, And you can also make it, as I said, a species of moral discourse. You can apply values to it. The facts are the facts, but what you make of the facts is essentially a matter of moral choice and moral interpretation.
But back to the sort of overarching narrative, I remember when it was a triumphalist narrative, essentially, and then the next phase was to be more inclusive, sort of along the lines of Patricia Limerick's work. And in the school curricula, then you would have a sidebar about a Mexican woman. You'd have a sidebar about an important Native resistance, but it didn't really percolate into the full narrative, but at least it was there. It was a politics of greater inclusion. But if we now believe that everybody has to be at the table, and the narrative is, yes, America is an extraordinary experiment, but it's been characterized by darkness, racism, sexism, environmental extraction from the beginning, and that while this doesn't discredit America, it casts a cloud over any totally positive view of our history. Good luck selling that in 2024 as the narrative of the United States. You know that when Barack Obama went to Egypt and said the slightest thing about American mistakes, he was assailed. No one apologizes for America. How dare you apologize for America? So if you're a novelist, how would you begin to create a consensus narrative for the country now?
I would do it by not being afraid of the response that you just characterized. Yeah, you're going to get, if you include critique in your analysis, if you include a critical view of the society, then you're going to antagonize those who have a vested interest in not looking at that critique. Like Governor DeSantis has racial policies that make it necessary for him to think slavery was a good thing. Racial attitudes that make him go that way. There's nothing to be done about that. And my theory of myth is stories are told by lots of different people from lots of different perspectives. And you have to see if the public will adopt them or not. You'll get blowback, but tell the story anyway. I think the deeper problem is if I couldn't imagine writing an American history textbook covering the whole damn thing at this point. It's just it's beyond, it's too complex. But I can imagine the retelling of key stories in such a way that you alter the structures, the larger structures, mythic structures, of which those stories are a part. You mentioned the Great Sioux Reservation. So retell the story of the Custer's Last Stand and the Great Sioux War, of which that was a part, in such a way that Red Cloud and the Sioux and Sitting Bull get equal time with Custer and Grant and the Northern Pacific Railroad, and see if that changes. See if how that plays into the rest of your teaching about westward expansion. I don't think this is something that can be done in one fell swoop. I think it requires the choice of particular episodes and the redoing of them.
So I think most Americans by now are willing to throw Custer under the bus, but we're not willing to throw the project under the bus. In other words, we can agree that the Lakota were doing what you might expect them to do in the Cheyenne, and that they had been provoked and they were resisting and protecting their lifeway and their sovereign homelands and so on. I think most Americans are essentially on board with that. But then that's the end of it, right? It doesn't say, oh my goodness, now we're going to have to rethink policy and we're going to have to find a way to harmonize with the Native resistance and to make sure that it's constantly central at the table in any story that we tell. I think we're willing to address these on a piecemeal basis, that a certain thing should not have occurred. And this is a really, really unfair question to one of America's most eminent historians, but in your work, which is amazing, have you moved the needle outside of academic circles?
Yeah, it's hard to know the answer to that. I do think that I've been working on this publishing on this since 1973. So I think the answer to that is partly yes. I mean, I wrote a big book about Custer and the Custer myth. And if that myth has now come to think, well, Custer was a loser from the start and
he had it coming
on their side, then I had something to do with that. No single book can affect the necessary transformation of American culture and American myths that one might desire. But if everyone writes books, if lots of people write books, if readers who read the book tell the story to other people, then the story multiplies and picks up and may acquire the kind of authority which something like The Lost Cause or the Frontier Myth has acquired over time. It's the multiplication of stories, not any one story that tells you. And that's like voting, That's like the people choosing to read and accept a story rather than blow it off.
Yeah, a couple of quick responses. You said that no single book, of course. Yes and no. Uncle Tom's Cabin, Move the Needle, The Jungle, Upton Sinclair's book. Theodore Roosevelt wrote him a letter, a nasty letter, but saying, if you're right, we'll do something about this. And it turned out it was worse than what was reported in Sinclair's book, The Jungle, Silent Spring. And so in other words, this happens. But the second point is that a book like yours, a marvelous tome, well-written, accessible, clear, doesn't have the same chance in 2024 that it might have had in 1974. That the way that books, the way that we apprehend culture, the way we absorb information, the way we figure things out has changed so dramatically that books have in some sense been demoted from their centrality, don't you think?
I think that's true. I think it's also true of my secondary thing, which is to turn the history into novels. Rewrite the history of the Civil War by writing a novel about the Battle of the Crater. And I think novels have been devalued in the same way. But the making of fictions continues. And some of those will have the kind of effect that you've described for Uncle Tom's Cabin and The Jungle and Grapes of Wrath. You could throw in there, too. How does it play into the long-term effect of the culture? Uncle Tom's Cabin did great things for the cause of abolition, but not such great things for the restructuring of American concepts of race.
She has no agenda for that. I mean, she's crying foul in a marvelous way, but she didn't say at the end, she didn't have an epilogue, here's what America could look like. That wasn't her interest.
That's right. And telling the story of the Great Sioux Reservation, I don't see anyone who has actually tried to tell the story of what life would look like in that part of South Dakota, North Dakota, if it had been preserved. What sort of economic entity would the Sioux Nation now be? Cattle ranching, mining? What would they have done with that very viable economic unit of territory that they had there? Also unknowable. But if you take them seriously as a people, as a political and economic unit, there was a potential history there. Might have been. That's maybe worth imaginatively exploring.
And there still is, by the way, Rich, because the overwhelming majority of the acreage in the Black Hills is public land. Most non-natives think of, you're going to confiscate white lands and dispossess people, which is just reverse, of what happened before. But the fact is that if the country really wanted to, it could grant back the majority of the Black Hills to Lakota and Cheyenne and have cooperative management relationships and so on. Again, there's a failure of imagination in all of this, I think. Let me go back to storytelling, because you mentioned Steinbeck. He thought that there were only a handful of stories. The storyteller creates the myth of people, and this is what we're doing is running variations on it now. I think he was right that you can make an argument about global climate change. It may or may not have traction, but a compelling story about these things really can attract human attention, empathy, and commitment. And I think you're right. The Republicans are good at telling a story. In my opinion, the right, I'm not talking about mainstream Republicanism if there is any, but the right wing of the Republican Party tells moronic stories, like everything was okay in 1950. That's nuts, but it works. They have the myth of the founders. In other words, the right tells a series of nostalgia stories, highly distorted and selective, that suggest there once was a kind of an American paradise that has been destroyed by feminists and environmentalists and so on. But it works. That's the point. Their narrative works to get about 70 million people to endorse it.
Yeah, I think that it's partly the selection of stories, but there's a few. I like to use the flags that were flying on January 6th as a kind of a key to the stories that are deployed. You've got the Betsy Ross flag, American Revolution. You've got the rattlesnake flag, Don't Tread on Me, the Gadsden flag, which is not just the American Revolution, but the gun rights movement, and particularly the gun rights movement, the piece of it which says that gun rights are there to give the people the right to shoot their leaders, to shoot tyrants, to resist the government. The next one was the Lost Cause, the
Confederate flag or Confederate iconography.
Which is really about, not just about defending slavery, but more than that, it's about overthrowing Reconstruction, which is the regime of liberals and blacks, and reestablishing white Christian male supremacy in the South, and using extraordinary violence to achieve that end. You're justified. And then finally, the myth of the frontier, coonskin hats, cowboy hats, no regulation, exploitation, and vigilantism. Those three myths are very traditional. They go back to the origins, really, of, except, well, Lost Cause, not quite, but do look back to the origins of the country. They concern race. All three concern race, and all three justify the use of violence to achieve a political end. That's the core of each of those three stories. And that's why it's such a dangerous movement, why violence is at the core of the movement. And it's also the secret of its appeal, because it's the difference between a rom-com and an action movie. And the thing about myth is it's not just a way of thinking about the past. It gives you a script for responding to something that's going on in the present, something which resembles what went on in the past. Those three things, they've really got that going with MAGA.
What gives you cause for optimism as we approach 2026?
If anything gives me optimism, it is the liberalization of the culture, which has already occurred and which is deeply ingrained. I think that people's levels of tolerance are much broader than not as broad as we thought they were. I think that the young people have better attitudes about race, gender, sexuality, and so on, justice, than their elders do. I would hope that young people have taken leadership roles that are really quite extraordinary. Greta Thunberg, of course, become politically active out of that experience is an extraordinary thing and a very hopeful thing. And I would rest my hopes there with people who have that kind of orientation.
I urge everybody to get your book, A Great Disorder, National Myth and the Battle for America, Professor Richard Slotkin. We'll see all of you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.